Well, this afternoon I'm going to talk about space. Not about space travel or anything, but about expressions for referring to spatial position and spatial relations and spatial spatial relations. Okay. Essentially, this means looking at groups of words which have to do with space, spatial relations, and spatial position, especially prepositions, motion verbs, and such like. Now, spatial expressions, in fact, a rather large number of items actually have to do with. Is this? Which one's this? Quite a large number of linguistic expressions do have to do with space. Okay. First and foremost, with respect to English, would be the prepositions. And the prepositions are notoriously difficult, of course, for foreign learners. Any language which has prepositions, the prepositions are going to be difficult. So prepositions in, at, on, under, and so on. Adverbials, certain adverbial uses of prepositions like come in, get over, go over, and so on. Case is actually not relevant to English, or Chinese, of course. Motion verbs are come, go, etc. Certain locative nouns, like, that is, nouns designating a place, such as home, up, home, top, the inside, and so on. Also, there are the dimensional adjectives like high, tall, low, deep, and so on. There won't be time to talk about the adjectives and so on. The case of the spatial or dimensional adjectives, they are actually quite problematic, or rather interesting as a group, but there won't be time to talk about those. I'll be focusing mainly on the prepositions and motion verbs, or rather motion events, how to describe motion events, an event of one thing going somewhere. Okay? Now, okay, let's begin with the prepositions. Like the book on the table, or the book is on the table. Okay, we need some terminology here. We would say in the expression the book on the table, or the book is on the table, in has to do with a spatial relation, the on relation in this case. And we need to distinguish between the two things that are involved in the relation, namely the book and the table. There are two sets of terms in use, actually. The most general terms would be figure and ground. So the book, the thing that you are talking about, the thing that you are locating, you're saying where the book is. The book would be the figure, object, and the table, where the book is on the table has to do with where it is. That will be the ground. So you're locating a figure with respect to a ground. The figure, that would be the thing that you are basically interested in, right? The ground, that would be the background information, if you like. Lanneker's terminology here is trajector and landmark. I won't use those. They are quite difficult terms. I think we'll stick to the more traditional, the more general terms, figure and ground. Now, I've mentioned figure and ground before, actually, I think in the first lecture. When you perceive a scene, you don't perceive everything as of equal importance. You focus your attention on certain aspects, certain features of what you're looking at, and the rest is the background information. For example, as I look out in front of me, the figure or the figures would be the people, the faces in front of me, and the wall at the back, white and green. That is not in my focus of attention. I could, of course, reverse this and focus on the wall at the back, and everybody else would become the ground. So the figure and ground organization is an aspect of the way we perceive things. We don't perceive everything equally, but certain things are important. We focus attention on them. And other things are then the background against which you focus, against which what you're interested in then stands out. So the figure object is the object of attention, is what you are interested in, and this is then located in the expression the book on the table. The figure is what you're interested in, and this is located with respect to vis-a-vis something else, namely the ground. Now, what makes the difference between the figure and the ground? Why is the figure, and why is the ground, the ground? Well, if you have the case of the book on the table, as opposed to the other way of saying it, the table under the book. If you say the table under the book, you are reversing the figure-ground relation. You are saying, where is the table? Well, it's under the book. That would be a funny thing to say. Now, why is it funny? Well, generally, the figure object is small and movable, and the ground object is large and fixed. Or to put it another way, if you have the book on the table, you can move the book without moving the table, but you can't move the table without moving the book. Right? So the figure object is usually small, it can be moved, and it's usually something which is inherently more interesting when you are more interested in books and tables, presumably. Normally, people are figures, and inanimate objects are the ground, because we are naturally interested in people rather than things. So you would say, the person next to the blackboard rather than the blackboard next to the person, because people are more interesting than things. Living things are more interesting than non-living things. Well, things which move are more interesting than things which don't move. Okay, so there is, in general, in these spatial expressions, there is a certain asymmetry. I have a piece of chalk here. Now, if I use, that is, okay. Okay, it is not a symmetrical relation. So the book on the table, the book and the table are not of equal importance. One is more important than the other. Okay? Now, this is an aspect of construal. Construal, going back to the first lecture, it has to do with how we, human language users, perceive and organize a particular scene. From a purely objective perspective, there's no difference between the book on the table and the table under the book. They're both true. They're both equally valid ways of describing the scene. It's we, the way we perceive things, that gives rise to the figure-ground organization and the asymmetrical relation between the two things. Okay. Now, that is generally true of prepositions. Prepositions locate one thing with respect to the other. And, okay, what words are we talking about? Well, there's about a couple of dozen of these words in English: in, on, at, under, above, across, through, by, next to, near, beside. Oh, you are familiar with them. They are very common words. They're amongst the most frequent words in the language. They all can be used to designate this relation between the figure and the ground. And nearly all of them have a spatial uses. The one possible exception to that is with. well, width is not so much a spatial relation. Well, it can be a spatial relation, but it's to do with accompanying something. But that also has a spatial component, obviously. Before is one that probably doesn't have a spatial use. Before would refer to time, not space. So one lecture is before another lecture. That is a relation of time. You would not say, for example, the table before the blackboard. That wouldn't work. So before is restricted to time relations and other relations, but it does not have spatial meaning. Okay. Now, I've said that they have to do with this relation between the figure and the ground. The basic use of prepositions, as I say, is things like the book, on the table, and so on. Sometimes the ground need not be mentioned. If you say the boss is in, well, in is a preposition, obviously, but in some cases you don't have to mention the ground. Obviously, if you say the boss is in, it means he's in his office or building or house or whatever. So the ground would then be understood from the context. Or he went out, well, out of the house, presumably. Or he went into the house. So sometimes the ground can be understood. It doesn't have to be mentioned. And some people might say that the boss is in is actually not a preposition anymore. It's a sort of adverb. But I think we can regard it as a preposition where the ground is not actually stated. Now, when looking at these couple of dozen prepositions in English, how do we distinguish them? How do we distinguish their meanings? And here are some ways in which prepositions can differ in meaning. You see, yes. The first distinction is between what you might call static and dynamic, where the relation between the figure and ground is a stable one. The book is on the table. So on is a stable relation. Nothing moves. There is no change. But if I say I put the book onto the table, then the book goes onto. There is movement. There's change. First, the book is not on the table, then it is. Right? So onto is a dynamic relation. To go out of the room, well, first you start in, then you are out of. Right? So there's a change. To walk over the hill, you start here and you end up there. So over has this dynamic sense. To walk round the corner. Right? So, in other words, with dynamic prepositions, there is, if you like, more than one place involved. In fact, there's a whole series of places. So you start here and then you end up there. So the static versus dynamic prepositions. Now, another distinction here, which has to do with actually static and dynamic, is whether the figure is one single object or whether it has to be complex, whether it has to be composed of a large number of objects. For example, if you have, say, suppose you have a garden and you have a tree. You can have the tree in the garden, obviously, but you can't have a tree around the garden. Right? For around would be that relation. You can have a footpath around the garden. You can have trees, lots of trees planted around the garden, but you cannot have a tree around the garden. It doesn't make sense. Because around requires that the figure is more than one. Right? Or in the case of a footpath around the garden, the figure has got to be a long object. It can't be a single thing. Okay? So that actually is quite an important distinction and has some rather interesting consequences. Now, a third way of distinguishing prepositions has to do with what kind of ground entity you have to have, the properties of the ground. For example, if you say the book is on the table, then, or the book is on something, the ground has got to be something with a surface, basically two-dimensional surface. If you say that the book is in something, then the something has got to be a container. Okay, it's got to have an inside, basically. With at, meet somebody at the station, then here the actual properties of the ground actually are not important. Okay? Or if you go through something, then it's got to be a kind of solid object, right? And if you go round, it's got to have this sort of outside. Now, another distinction, which is a rather interesting one, what is often referred to as topological versus projective. The nature of the spatial relation. The topological spatial relations, those are relations which are, they're basically sort of geometrical, the kinds of things that you could represent mathematically in geometry, and they are independent of the observer. So the book is on the table is true, could be true, it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter where you are standing or where you are looking at it from. Whereas the projective prepositions, these depend on the observer. And an obvious example here would be in front of and behind. So if something is in front of me, well, it has to do with me and my front. And if something is in front of you, or I can see that something is in front of the window, well, where is in front of the window? Well, it depends where I am. If I'm here, it's sort of this side of the window. If I'm outside of the building, then in front of the window is on the other side of the window. You see what I mean? Left and right are also cases where which depend on the observer. So which is left and which is right? Well, it depends how you're standing. Okay? Now, here's a list of some other dimensions, some other features, if you like, which can be used to distinguish prepositions. First of all, the figure and ground, where they are related on the vertical dimension, so the up-down relation. Obviously, above and below, if here, above, below. Over, beneath, on, would typically have to do with higher than. So, one dimension has to do with the up-down relation. Another dimension, as I mentioned just before, is the dimensionality of the ground. Whether the ground is three-dimensional, you understand these geometrical concepts, okay? One dimension, two dimensions, three dimensions. Okay, three-dimensional ground, into and out of, require a three-dimensional ground. You go into the building, you go out of the building, you put something into the box, you take it out of the box. One or two-dimensional, this is a line or a surface, you put something onto the table and you take it off the table. You don't take it out of the table. Well, if you say out of the table, this means the table has a little box inside it. You take it off the table. And then you have the zero-dimensional, which means that the ground is basically a point, or else that the dimensionality is not relevant. This would be the case of at. I'll see you at the station. Well, of course, the station does have dimensions, right? But linguistically, it is construed as if it is simply a place, a point, at the station. It could be inside, could be outside, it just, a place. So I'll see you at the station, you go to the station, so to will be to this, again, a dynamic preposition, to this point, and away from. Here, actually, you see another way in which prepositions can differ, whether the prepositions designate a place, the static ones, and the dynamic ones would be to. Let's write this down. There's the chalk on. Using the stuff. Okay. And the dynamic ones could be motion towards a goal being where you're going to. So to would be for a goal, into would be a goal, onto would be the goal. Then that is the ground object is where you're going to. And the opposite of that would be the source, where you are coming from. Off, out of, away from. And there is a third one, which is the path. You go round the garden. In other words, the path that you take. Of course, as you go from the source to the goal, you'll go along a path. But different prepositions, different dynamic prepositions can focus on where you're going to, where you're coming from, and the way that you go. Okay, the next point, this relates actually to the simple versus complex. The dimensionality, there's a misprint there. It should be the dimensionality and numerosity of, of the figure, not the ground. In other words, this is the case of, I say things like in the book, in the book in the box. Well, it could be one book, you could say the books in the box and so on. But in this case, around the trees planted around the garden, the figure has got to be either a lot of separate things, the trees around the garden, or it has got to be extended, the footpath around the garden. Okay? And equally for the along. Okay, there you have a river. Okay, and along would be, let's use red for the figure, would be that. The road goes along the river. Right? There are trees planted along the river. Right? But you cannot say there is a tree along the river. Well, actually you can, but that means something different. We'll come to that in a moment. Okay, these are then some of the dimensions. Now, the next one is perhaps an easier one, whether there is contact between the figure and the ground. A characteristic of on, of course, the book on the table, there has got to be contact. Okay? But the prepositions above and over, there is generally no contact. So you would say the lights above the table. Right? The table is here, the lights are above the table. You would not say the lights are on the table, because they're not. They're not touching. Right? So over and above generally do not have contact. There's no contact between figure and ground. Under and underneath and below are a bit tricky, actually. Below would generally not have contact. There are generally no contact. The table is below the lights. The table is under the light. I'm not so sure with that, actually. With the under, beneath, below, it's not so clear whether there has to be contact or not. But with on versus above, it's actually quite clear. Okay, so contact, and then there's a question of how close the things are, by and near. There is sort of contact. There's no contact, but it's a relation of proximity. You're close. Then there is how actually specific the meaning of the preposition is. For example, you could say that inside, the book inside the box is perhaps more specific than simply the book in the box. So inside actually focuses on the container relation. An example of that, I could say the chalk is in my hand, okay? But I couldn't really say the chalk is inside my hand. That would be funny. Right? Then finally, although these prepositions are spatial prepositions, they very often have components of meaning which are actually non-spatial. So they are not pure spatial expressions. There's very often some extra idea which is not strictly spatial. For example, on, characteristic of on, okay, I've said it's, book on the table, but it's not just a spatial relation. There is here the idea that the book is supported by the table. If the table wasn't there, the book would fall. Right? So, and this idea of support occurs in other uses of the preposition on, in which, in fact, you do not have this vertical relation. For example, you can have the picture on the wall. So the wall, and there is the picture on the wall. That is not the up-down relation, but the idea of the picture on the wall is that the picture is sort of hanging on the wall. The picture is held in position by being attached to the wall. And another example of that would be things like, these lights are not actually on the ceiling, but you could have, a fly on the ceiling. The ceiling, and you have a fly on the ceiling. Now, the relation there is that one. There's the ceiling and there's the fly. So it's the reverse of that. So how do you justify the fly on the ceiling? Well, the fly is stuck to the ceiling. It's attached to the ceiling. There is also, I think, the idea that the figure object is visible. Right? If the fly is on the ceiling, you can see it. Okay? That might well be one feature there. Other uses of on which focus on the attachment, you would say there is something on the bottom of the tabletop. So here, something is here. Somebody has a piece of, put some chewing gum under the table. You would say, where is the chewing gum? It's on the bottom of the table, right? And clearly there it's attachment rather than this vertical relation. So on has the idea of support. In, in can have actually two possibly contradictory additional aspects. If something is in the box, it is sort of hidden. You can't see it. You can't get at it. So in can have the idea of something is concealed. It's hidden. It's away. You can't get at it. Right? Equally, in can also focus on something that is visible. If somebody comes into the room, then he joins us. Right? He is then visible and accessible, and we interact. Okay, we'll perhaps come back to that later. With, as I said, focuses on not just, two people together, but also the idea of they accompany each other. Where one goes, the other goes. Right? Okay, I mentioned the projective prepositions. Here's a bit more about these. Projective prepositions, these, as I say, are understood. The spatial relation is, as I say, understood. There is an observer. Projective expressions assume the location of a speaker to the left of, well, to my left, to my right, in front of and behind. They have a deictic component. Deictic, do you know? Deixis. This means that you can only understand the word or expression with reference to the speaker, to the where, when, and who. Now is a deictic expression. Today is a deictic expression. If I say the word today, tomorrow, it refers to a different day. Okay? So they have a deictic sense. There's a deictic center. And here, in fact, there is a possibility of confusion because the deictic center can actually switch. If I say, who is sitting to your left? You actually don't know what I mean. My left or your left. So you are to her left, from my point of view, but from your point of view, it's the other way around. So if you talk about who is sitting to your left, if I say to you, who is sitting to your left, you actually are not quite sure how to interpret that. You don't know whose point of view, which perspective you are to take. In front of is another nice example. In front of is easy to interpret if the ground object has a front. Okay, people have fronts. Right? It gets a bit tricky with non-living things. Does a house have a front? If children are playing in front of the house, where are they playing? Well, you can say the house has a front, namely it is where you go in and out. It's the front door. But there's another interpretation of the house in front of the house, namely, draw a picture here. There's the house, and that's me, and in front of the house is here. In front of the house is between me and the house. Likewise, if you say the children are playing in front of the tree, a tree does not have a front. Right? But in front of the tree is between me and the tree. And behind the tree would be here, but there's the observer here. So these can be a little complicated. Okay, now some other aspects of prepositions. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, actually, but one of the difficulties with prepositions in English and in languages which have prepositions is that prepositions are very, very polysemous. They have lots of different uses, lots of different meanings. They have spatial meanings. They have, of course, all the metaphorical, non-spatial meanings. But even if we just restrict ourselves to spatial uses of prepositions, you see that they are still very polysemous. It's not the case that each preposition can refer to one kind of spatial relation, all sorts of spatial relations, and that, of course, is one of the big difficulties of them. Now, here we get onto some of the ways in which prepositions can be polysemous. It's interesting, actually, because the polysemy does have a certain system to it. There are sort of patterns, there are regularities that you can see. For example, the static place prepositions, like in, on, and so on, very often have both place and goal interpretations. For example, you can say the picture is on the wall, that's static, but you also hang the picture on the wall. That is, you actually put the picture on the wall. So the wall is the goal, on the wall is the goal. So one and the same preposition can be used to refer to where the picture is and where the picture goes to. And that is very common, of course. Like, the money is in the box, you put the money in the box. Or the into is perhaps a little more, is perhaps exclusively goal, but there is, in general, this polysemy between place and goal. The big exception there is at, actually. If you are at the station, that is place, but to go to at the station, you don't say, I went at the station. It would have to be to. Okay. And similarly, place and source readings with out and away from. You come out of prison, which is source, and once you have come out of prison, you are out of prison, which is a place. Another actually complicating thing about English prepositions, which you may have noticed, is that very often you can sort of string them together into rather complex expressions. My favorite one is the second there, come on in from out of the rain. Come in from out of the rain. Right? Okay? It's raining. You are in the rain. You are standing in the rain. I am inside the house. And I say to you, come in to the house from the rain and get out of the rain. Right? So come in from out of the rain. So that is actually quite complex, as you can see. Another one would be take it out from under the bed. Out from under. Okay? So you have a bed, you have something under the bed. Suitcase under the bed, that's where you keep the suitcase. So you take the suitcase. Okay, the suitcase is under the bed, and you take the suitcase out from under the bed. Okay? Another one would be, it is up in the attic. That's a simple one. The attic, that is at the very top of a house. So the suitcase is in the attic, but it's up at the top of the building in the attic. So you put the suitcase up in the attic. You take it down from up in the attic. Doesn't quite work. Okay. Okay. You see it gets quite complicated. It can get quite complicated. Now, here I want to next focus on the case of the figure being either a single thing or a thing consisting of lots of parts or an extended thing. Like, we've lost the diagram, like the trees around the garden, or the footpath around the garden. Now, there's a bunch of prepositions which require the figure object to be numerous objects or an extended object, like around, along, through, across, and over. So these require that the figure is multiplex. It consists of parts. Either it's, say, a lot of things, or it's an extended thing. And they also require that the ground has a certain shape and size. For example, a tunnel through the mountain has got to be a solid, the ground has got to be a solid thing. And the tunnel is an extended thing going through the solid object. So you can say that there is a tunnel through the mountain, but you can't really say there is a bus through the mountain. Well, again, you could, but it would mean something different. You would say the tunnel goes through the mountain, or the bus goes through the mountain, because then the bus traces a path. Now, you say the road, the river example, the road along the river, the trees along the river, but you can't really say the tree along the river. Yes, actually, this should have come a little early. You have the difference between the place and the goal. Oh, when I say a place preposition, like money in the box or whatever, as opposed to a dynamic preposition, it doesn't mean that the figure cannot move. If you, for example, drive around in the city, this would be a place. A static use of in, although you are driving around, because your driving around is located in the city. If you see what I mean. Whereas if you drive into the city, then you go from out of the city to into the city. Okay, now coming back to the multiplex prepositions. Sorry, that slide should have come earlier. Never mind. Okay, the multiplex prepositions, like over, along, across, and through, these give rise to systematic polysemy. First of all, you can have the figure could be an extended object, like the road along the river. It could be, the figure could consist of a lot of different things, a lot of things, like the trees along the river. The figure could be a moving object, in which case you're talking about the path of the moving object. You walk along the river. And fourth one, they live along the river. Now this is why I said the tree along the river could mean something in certain circumstances. So if you draw a picture of this again, so there's the river. So the road along the river is that. Trees along the river, the trees are planted like that. If you walk along the river, you walk like that. But if you say they live along the river, they live there and you are here. Okay? In other words, to get to them, you have to go along the river. So they live here and your perspective, your viewpoint is there. So here, along the river, designates not so much a path, but the end point of a path. It's like the around the corner that we looked at earlier. Okay, now these various prepositions, along, across, around, actually all over, also gives rise to this sort of polysemy. Okay, now what do we have next? Just one comment here on differences between languages and cultures. Research on prepositions, on spatial relations, you can see quite easily how you could do research in different languages and different cultures on prepositions. You give people pictures of scenes with a figure object and a ground object, and you ask them to describe them. Okay? And one interesting difference is that English is a very preposition-focused language. Prepositions are very important. They carry a lot of information. So given a picture in which you have an envelope and a stamp on it, right? In English you would just say, well, the stamp is on the envelope. There's a stamp on the envelope. What has been found in many languages, actually, you wouldn't say that. You would say the stamp has been attached to the envelope. Right? You actually mention the process by which the situation comes about. Would you do that in Chinese? Just the stamp on the envelope, or the stamp is attached to the envelope, or has been attached to the envelope? So you would say attach. Yes, okay, so you would do that as well, yes. Rather than say where the stamp is, you would basically say how it got there, right? The nature of the attachment, so to speak. But English, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't say the stamp has been attached to the envelope. Well, unless you wanted to. But where is the stamp? The stamp is on the envelope. So the preposition actually carries a lot of information. Right? So English is a sort of information as a preposition-focused language, so to speak. Okay. As I mentioned, spatial expressions, prepositions, tend to be highly polysemous. They also tend to be associated with a very large number of idiomatic uses. There's the whole question of the phrasal verbs, which are a nightmare, of course. And there are also the non-spatial or the metaphorical uses. I won't actually have very much to say about those, but let's see. Actually, this repeats something I've said before, doesn't it? Many prepositions have non-spatial components within, yes. Look at the last one, actually. An example of the way in which prepositions can be polysemous. If you say the dog crept under the table. The dog crept under the table. The creep, is this. There are three ways you can interpret that. Three quite different meanings. Can you see what they are? Okay, there is the table. One possibility is the dog starts here and the dog goes there. The dog crept under the table. Another possibility is the dog starts here and does that. Okay? The first one, under the table, is the goal. The second one is the path. And the third meaning would be the dog is here and sort of creeps round and round and round under the table. That is the place. The dog is under the table and there it is creeping round and round under the table. Another general point to make here is that the choice of preposition is very often determined not so much by the objective situation, but by how you look at it, how you construe it, in fact. At the supermarket, versus in the supermarket. I met them. No, sorry. No, what's happened here? I've done it again. How to get to this? Okay. Okay. What's happened here? Oh, you see somebody at the supermarket, you see somebody in the supermarket. In the station, at the station. Well, in, of course, here the supermarket is represented as a container. In the supermarket would be inside the shop. At the supermarket could be inside, could be outside. Right? It's in the field and on the field. You play football on a football field or in a football field? You play on the field, I think. The surface, right? But you would say, cabbages are growing in the field. So the field would then contain the growing activity. Although a field is simply a field, it's simply a two-dimensional thing, but it can be looked at as a surface on which things happen, or as a sort of container, right? Another interesting one in English would be in school versus at school. If you are in school, well, if you are in the school, you are inside the building. In school would be sort of involved in the educational business. At school, you aren't focusing on the building anymore, simply being educated, taking part in the school activities. Okay. Yes, we can forget about that. Yeah, and then I just want to say something briefly about, and this, as you are aware, is a major learning problem, are the non-spatial metaphorical uses of prepositions. And there are a lot of idiosyncratic things here which, actually just have to be learned. You read about something in the newspaper, but you see it on the television. Why that should be so, actually, I don't know. Perhaps because television, you have a screen, and that is a surface. So on the television screen, but in the newspaper, just like in a book, the book contains its information. There are some minor regularities. For example, you are on a diet, you're on medication, you're on drugs, and of course you get off your medication. A nice one is the stars came out and the stars went in, the lights went off and the lights came on, which combines the use of come and go, of course. The stars came out. Okay, it's nighttime, the sky is black, it's cloudy, the clouds go, and the stars become visible. The stars came out. Well, out of where? Well, here's the use of in and out, which has to do with visible versus invisible. If the stars go in, inside their container, and they become invisible, they come out and become visible. But the lights went off and the lights came on. It's a bit different. Of course, the lights came on, they are functioning, and then the lights went off, or indeed the lights went out. The lights went out, they become invisible. So the stars came out, you can see them. The lights went out, you can't see them. There you see actually quite nicely the different container metaphors involved here. Okay. Let me now say a few words about dynamic situations involving a figure which moves. And this involves also the use of verbs, motion verbs. If you take something like, well, I swam across the river. I swam across the river. Now, there are a number of components of this particular scene. These are, first of all, something moves, namely I. Secondly, I move in a particular way, namely by swimming, not walking or running or flying. There is the figure, that is the thing that moves. There is the ground, the thing with respect to which I move, that is the river in this particular case. There is the path that I take as I move. And the path, of course, has a source and a goal. Sometimes there's actually an additional element, that is somebody who causes somebody to move. If I say, I walked the dog around the block, okay? The dog walks around the block, but I am the one who makes the dog walk around the block. Or the airline flew me to New York. Okay, I am the one that moves. The airline causes me to move. New York is the goal, and so on. Fly is the way in which I move. So you have these large number of components of this motion situation. The figure, the ground, motion, the way you move, and the source, goal, and the path. Now, what is interesting about this, and there's been quite a lot of research done on this particular matter, is that it seems that different languages actually package these different components in different ways. Now, according to what I've read, Chinese would actually work rather like English. You can actually say, I swam across the river unproblematically. Is that true? You can translate it more or less word for word, like swim across the river. Well, maybe not. But there are languages in which you just cannot say that. And from the point of view of English speakers don't have to go very far to find languages where you can't do it. You can't do it in French or Spanish or whatever. For example, in French, you cannot say, I swam across the river. You'd have to say, I crossed the river swimming. Right? I crossed the river by swimming. You cannot say, I flew over the Atlantic. You would have to say, I crossed the Atlantic by plane. Right? And you cannot say, I ran around the garden. You would have to say, I circled the garden running. And you cannot even say a simple thing like, I walked into the room. You would have to say, I entered the room on foot, walking. Right? It has to do essentially with the way in which the event is packaged. Now, in English, I swam across the river. The verb swim refers to the manner of motion, how you move, whereas where you move and where you go to or from is expressed in the preposition phrase, and typically, of course, one of these. Well, it has to be one of those for goal, source, or path. So the prepositional phrase encodes the path and the ground. So to say fly over the Atlantic is the path, and the Atlantic being the ground. So there are basically two kinds of languages here, and English is very much the preposition language. The preposition carries the information. And in respect to this, you can actually make a distinction between two very broad kinds of motion verbs. You have the pure motion verbs, which simply express motion, like to enter, to exit, to surround, to circulate, to penetrate, and so on, or to go. So verbs which simply refer to motion of the figure with respect to the ground. But then you have actually, in English, a very large group of verbs which refer to how you move, the manner of motion. And there are dozens and dozens of these, actually. Well, run, sprint, limp, ride, saunter, jog, hundreds of them, which you can use in these motion events. So, as I said, I think I mentioned this earlier, you can roll out of bed. It's a roll out of bed. And that in English is absolutely unproblematic. But in, say, in other kinds of languages, you can't say that. You have to say you got out of bed with a roll or something. And one consequence of this is that the prepositions actually carry an awful lot of information. So you swim across the river, up the river, down the river. Using the same, the verb simply means how you move, but the prepositional phrase is where you do it, where you're coming from, where you're going to. And this fact about English, the fact that the prepositions are so weighty, they carry so much information, becomes apparent in all these things like these, which are actually quite idiomatic and perhaps odd. They may strike you as odd, but you can see that they sort of fit into the system of English. I'll see you to the door. Which means you're inside the house, you want to leave. Okay, I will see you to the door. I will accompany you to the door. I will take you to the door and say goodbye to you. So I will see you to the door. Now that is odd, of course, because see is not a motion verb. Right? See is not a motion verb. But, so I will see you to the door. I will, as I say, accompany you and see that you arrive at the door safely, whatever. So I'll see you to the door. I'll see you to the airport. You can also say things like that. Which is a very unusual use of see, because, as I say, see is not a motion verb, but it fits into the pattern. To the door is the goal, and see is the way in which we do it. And things like, I'll walk you to the station, which means I will take you to the station walking. I will walk with you to the station and show you the way. Right? Again, walk is simply a manner of motion, how you move, but where you go to, where you walk to, is then expressed in the prepositional phrase. Next one, I don't know whether you know this next one, I laughed all the way to the bank. Do you know that expression? It's a, as I recall, there was an American entertainer who was criticized by all the intellectuals because he was so vulgar and common and unintellectual. I'll do this again. That's what it is. And so the intellectuals, the clever people, laughed at him, and he said, well, yes, they laugh at me, but I laugh all the way to the bank. In other words, I make lots of money, and I take my money to the bank, and I laugh. You can laugh at me for being so silly and stupid and vulgar and unintellectual, but I laugh as much as you do. I laugh to the bank. Right? So here we go again. Yes. Do you know this one? They drank us under the table. They drank me under the table. Drink is not a motion verb. But you can drink somebody under the table. That is, you are with somebody drinking, and you drink so much that the person collapses and falls under the table. So I will drink you under the table. I will drink with you, make you drink so much that you fall off your chair under the table. That is a fixed idiom, right? But notice it fits the pattern. Under the table is the goal. You will end up under the table. And how will you end up under the table? The manner of motion through your drinking. Right? So that is a quite idiomatic example. But it's built on the same pattern, the pattern of these motion events. And the second last one there, this is the cowboy rode off into the sunset. This is the way in which many of those cowboy films finish. You know, you have the cowboy on his horse riding into the distance as the film ends, and then gets smaller and smaller as it gets further away. He rode off into the sunset, and that's the end of the film. Right? Again, that is a kind of thing which would actually be very difficult to translate into many languages. I don't know whether it would work in Chinese, or whether you would have problems translating that into Chinese. I would imagine so. But it's a very sort of English idiom, but it's built on the same pattern of these motion verbs. Okay, to ride is a manner of motion. Into the sunset would be the goal. And off is away from us into the sunset. Another interesting one is she wore her new dress to the party. What is interesting there is to rather than at. She wore her dress at the party is unproblematic. No problem. But her dress to the party means she wore it when she went to the party. It is this, to is the goal. Right? And actually, there are a whole set of non-spatial, metaphorical uses of prepositions built on very much the same pattern. Kind of metaphorical motion. It bored me out of my mind. What does that mean? Well, something is so boring, I just go mad. So it bored me out of my mind would be the goal. If I'm out of my mind, I am mad. And how do I become mad? Through being bored. So bore is sort of the manner of motion verb, but the metaphorical manner. They talked me into a coma. A coma, you are unconscious. Somebody talks and talks and talks so much, you can't take it anymore, you just fall asleep and disconnect. So they talked me into a coma. Again, talk is being used as a kind of motion verb, actually, a metaphorical motion verb. I end up in a coma. Why? Because people talk to me so much. Then you can talk somebody into doing something. You talk somebody into something, and you talk them out of something. So to talk somebody into something, you persuade them to do it. You talk them out of it, you convince them that they shouldn't do it. So again, the goal would be you are into the agreement, or they are out of the agreement. And how does somebody go into the agreement, or out of the agreement, out of accepting? Well, through talking to them. Okay, talk me through the proposal. Okay, I have made a proposal, and you say, well, talk me through it. That is, go through it with me by talking. Outline it to me. Just make the main points. Next one, the country is in recession. Okay, the economy is slowing. How does the government get the country out of recession. It spends its way out of recession, spends money, creates jobs and activity. He lied his way through the interview. I think we've mentioned that one before. I talked myself hoarse, which I'm doing now. Hoarse here means a sore throat, you can't speak. The goal, and you arrive there by talking too much. Sing me to sleep. Sleep would be the goal. How do you get to sleep? Somebody sings you to sleep. It is the manner of motion, the way in which you get there. Drag somebody into the discussion. Well, here the discussion would be a sort of place. Somebody doesn't want to take part in the discussion, but you drag that person into the discussion. Again, to drag, to make somebody come into the discussion against their will, actually. And another sentence, perhaps not quite so idiomatic, but it's built on the same pattern. He lived through the 2 world wars. He lived through the war. Again, through, this is the path. And live here will be a kind of metaphorical motion term, in fact. Okay, I want briefly, actually, to finish, well, perhaps not so briefly, by looking in some detail at a particular preposition. And it's polysemy. It's a kind of okay. This is based on the chapter in my categorization book, but I just go through it quickly. Round or around as a preposition. It's a preposition which requires a complex trajector. And I suppose the basic sense would be, here is the ground object. The ground object has an outside. It has a circumference. Okay? And round would seem to involve a path. I need the color here again. A path which follows the outline of something. And the outline, of course, could be followed outside or inside also. So it actually depends on what makes sense very often. If you walk around the lake, obviously it's here. If you swim around the lake, obviously it's here, for obvious reasons. So the characteristics of around then would be that the figure object, okay, the ground object has got to have this outside perimeter, circumference. The figure object has got to be a lengthy thing, like the footpath around the lake. It's got to consist of a lot of individual things. There are trees planted around the lake. Or it's got to be a path. You walk around. So there's the idea then of the following the circumference. There's also the idea of a circular path, right? And some related uses of fly. You fly round the world would be this circular thing. You walk round the park. Okay. You drive round the corner. This would be, okay, there's the corner, and then you drive like that. Notice here you don't have to do a full circle. It can just be changing direction. Little more complicated is the next one. We drove round the city centre looking for a parking place. So this is the city centre, and your path is sort of like that. Drove around everywhere. But the path is contained within the circumference. But then you can actually take away the ground and say we drove around for hours looking for a parking place. We drove around for hours. I walked around for hours, lost. So you just walk around. This idea of a path which actually doesn't have any structure. A kind of random path in all directions. You don't know where you're going. Like that. Notice we've come quite a long way from here. But they're kind of related. Then you have other uses like a room for people, and people were standing round the room. People were standing round. What does this mean? Now the second one, actually you take away the ground and simply say, well, there were people just standing around. People were just standing around. In other words, you had people like that standing around. Now, next one, go round the guests and introduce yourself. Okay, you have a room full of people at a party, and you go and introduce yourself to people. You go to this one, go to that one, go to that one, go to that one. So you trace this random path. Pass this paper around the class. I give you a paper, and then you pass it to each person in turn. So again, the paper goes from one person to the other. Then you get even further away from the basic sense, this sense of following the outside. He lives around here somewhere. Around here somewhere. So around here somewhere. Some vague place near here. In what direction, I don't know. Will you be around next year? Which means, will you be more or less in this place next year? Are you going to be here next year? Somewhere around here next year? Or are you going to be some other place? I'll see you around. A very non-committal thing to say. I'll see you someday when you're around and when I'm around. We'll meet by chance, possibly. This guy's been around. If you've been around, that would have the sense that you have been in all sorts of places and you have experienced lots of things. So you've been around, you know the world, you have a lot of experience. You are not naive. Then the expression to sleep around, you sleep with lots of different people. That's also actually a sense of he's been around also. Come round and see us sometime. Well, come and see us sometime. No? So here I have the idea of some vague amounts. There are around 50 people present. About. Further uses of round, you see it's a very complex word, but you see how the different senses perhaps are connected in a sense. Notice fly round the world, it's the idea of circular motion. If you turn round, it's sort of that sort of activity. Interestingly, that compares with turn over. If you turn over, you are lying in bed and you turn over. You turn over in bed, but you turn round like that. And wheels turn round, you put something round your waist, and people stood round me in a circle. So they formed the circle. They stood around me, I am the center, they formed a circle. Okay, and finally, a few things about the metaphorical uses, based on extensions of some of these rather complex spatial uses. We have a problem, find a way to get round it. We have a problem, find a way to get round it. Okay? What does that involve? Well, it's as if that is the problem. You are starting here on your journey, and you get round it. That would be the sort of image that is involved. So you can't go through it. You've got to avoid it, and you make a detour, and you get round it. So that is the kind of image involved with the path here. So find a way to get round this problem. So you don't actually address the problem. You avoid the problem. You find a way not to address the problem. Right? And this comes out in the second one, actually. You're just going round the problem. You're not addressing it. The problem is still there. You're just going round it. Right? That actually contrasts with to get over something, actually, where the metaphor is not that, but in fact that. And that would typically be used for you've had some bad experience in your life, something bad has happened, somebody has died or something, and you get over it. That is, you try to come to terms with the problem, and then you try to continue life again. So you get over a problem, right? What about number 3? She knows how to get round her mother. Here the mother is not so much a problem, but the mother has sort of wishes and makes demands, and you get round somebody by sort of persuading them to give you what you want, basically. Turn your life around. Well, again, this is the idea of life as a journey, having a direction, and your life can obviously be going in a bad direction. Right? But if you turn your life around, then you start going in a good direction again. So again, the idea of that, changing direction. Another idiomatic one, I'll get round to doing it someday. Again, I'll get round to it someday. It's very sort of vague and non-committal. Someday, perhaps I'll find time to do this. I'll get round to addressing the issue. And the final ones actually involve quite specifically the next one, the circular motion. Spring comes round again. This would be the seasons form a circle. Right? They repeat themselves. So spring comes round again. And next one you can work out, if you work around the clock, the hour hand goes round. If you work around the clock, this means you work for 12 hours. 24 hours, probably, without interruption. So you work around the clock, you work without interruption. And do you have any more here? No, that's the last one. A round number. 50 is a round number. 47 is not a round number. 500 is a nice round number. 490 is not a nice round number. A round number is an approximate number to the nearest 50, 100, 1,000, 10, or whatever. So a nice round number is an approximate number to the nearest 10, 20, nearest 10, 50, 100, 1,000. So 200 people, that's a nice round number. 197 is not. 190 is not. So it has to do with the approximation. Right? Like around 100 people, approximately 100 people. Okay, so that is an illustration of some of the aspects of a single preposition. Around is actually quite a complicated one. That's why I chose it. Over is another very complicated one. But I would think that just about any of the English prepositions are equally complex. If you look at them from the point of view of all the different spatial uses they have, their idiomatic uses, their non-spatial uses, and and their uses in so-called phrasal verbs, which actually I haven't addressed. So I've simply, scratched the surface a little bit of some of the aspects of English prepositions and spatial and motion verbs. The topic is interesting, I think, especially interesting, because on the one hand, spatial relations and motion would seem to be pretty universal. I mean, we all experience motion. We move, we walk around, we see spatial relations. But the interesting thing is that different languages actually do categorize these things differently. It's actually quite remarkable that this universal domain of space and motion and movement, that it should give rise to so much variation between languages, which is, of course, why learning these prepositions and so on is so incredibly difficult. The spatial expressions, in fact, are amongst some of the most difficult things to actually master in a foreign language. Precisely because there is so much variation, and the variation is often in the very small details, actually. Okay, and it all has to do essentially with how speakers construe spatial relations. So spatial relations are actually a very good place for investigating, for looking at the way in which different languages actually construe these pretty universal aspects of experience. Okay then, well, thank you for your patience once again.